Track 3. The Woman in White. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Woman in White by Wilkie Collins. Read by
Tim Bulkley of BigBible.org.
Track 3.
The First Epoch. 8. When I entered the room, I found Miss Halcombe and an elderly lady seated at the luncheon table. The elderly lady, when I was presented to her, proved to be Miss Fairley's former governess, Mrs. Vasey, who had been briefly described to me by my lively companion at the breakfast table as possessed of all the cardinal virtues and counting for nothing. I can do little more than offer my humble testimony to the truthfulness of Miss Halcombe's sketch of the old lady's character. Mrs. Vasey looked the personification of human composure and female amiability. A calm enjoyment of a calm existence beamed in drowsy smiles on her plump, placid face. Some of us rush through life, and some of us saunter through life. Mrs. Vasey sat through life. Sat in the house early and late, sat in the garden, sat in unexpected window-seats in passages, sat on a camp stool when her friends tried to take her out walking, sat before she looked at anything, before she talked of anything, before she answered yes or no to the commonest question, always with the same serene smile on her lips, the same vacantly attentive turn of the head, the same snugly comfortable position of her hands and arms under every possible change of domestic circumstances, a mild, a compliant, an unutterably tranquil and harmless old lady, who never by any chance suggested the idea that she had been actually active since the hour of her birth. Nature has much to do in this world, and is engaged in generating such a vast variety of coexistent productions that she must surely be now and then too flurried and confused to distinguish between the different processes that she is carrying on at the same time. Starting from this point of view, it will always remain my private persuasion that Nature was absorbed in making cabbages when Mrs. Vasey was born, and that the good lady suffered the consequences of a vegetable preoccupation in the mind of the mother of us all. "Now, Mrs. Vasey," said Miss Halcombe, looking brighter, sharper, and readier than ever, by contrast with the undemonstrative old lady at her side. "What will you have? A cutlet?" Mrs. Vasey crossed her dimpled hands on the edge of the table, smiled placidly, and said, "Yes, dear." "What is that opposite Mr. Hartright? Boiled chicken, is it not? I thought you liked boiled chicken better than cutlet, Mrs. Vasey." Mrs. Vasey took her dimpled hands off the edge of the table and crossed them on her lap instead, nodded contemplatively at the boiled chicken, and said, "Yes, dear." "Well, but which will you have to-day? Shall Mr. Hartright give you some chicken, or shall I give you some cutlet?" Mrs. Vasey put one of her dimpled hands back again on the edge of the table, hesitated drowsily, and said, "Which you please, dear." "Mercy me, it's a question of your taste, my good lady, not for mine. Suppose you have a little of both. Suppose you begin with the chicken, because Mr. Hartright looks devoured by anxiety to carve for you." Mrs. Vasey put the other dimpled hand back on the edge of the table, brightened dimly one moment, went out again the next, bowed obediently, and said, "If you please, sir." Surely a mild, compliant, and unutterably tranquil and harmless old lady, but enough, perhaps, for the present, of Mrs. Vasey. All this time there were no signs of Miss Fairley. We finished our luncheon, and still she never appeared. Miss Halcombe, whose quick eye nothing escaped, noticed the looks that I cast from time to time in the direction of the door. "I understand you, Mr. Hartright," she said. "You're wondering what's become of your other pupil. She's been downstairs and has got over her headache, but has not sufficiently recovered her appetite to join us at lunch. If you'll put yourself under my charge, I think I can undertake to find her somewhere in the garden." She took up a parasol lying on a chair near me, and led the way out by a long window at the bottom of the room, which opened on the lawn. It's almost unnecessary to say that we left Mrs. Vasey still seated at the table, with her dimpled hands still crossed on the edge of it, apparently settled in that position for the rest of the afternoon. As we crossed the lawn, Miss Halcombe looked at me significantly and shook her head. "That mysterious adventure of yours," she said, "still remains involved in its own appropriate midnight darkness. I've been all morning looking over my mother's letters, and have made no discoveries yet. However, don't despair, Mr. Hartright. This is a matter of curiosity, and you have got a woman for your ally. Under such conditions success is certain sooner or later. The letters are not exhausted. I have 3 packets still left, and you may confidently rely on my spending the whole evening over them. Here, then, was one of my anticipations of the morning still unfulfilled. I began to wonder next whether my introduction to Miss Fairley would disappoint the expectations that I had been forming of her since breakfast time. "And how did you get on with Mr. Fairley?" inquired Miss Halcombe, as we left the lawn and turned into a shrubbery. "Was he particularly nervous this morning? Never mind considering about your answer, Mr. Hartright. The mere fact of your being obliged to consider is enough for me. I see in your face that he was particularly nervous, and I am amiably unwilling to throw you into the same condition. I ask no more." We turned off into a winding path while she was speaking, and approached a pretty summer-house built of wood in the form of a miniature Swiss chalet. The one room of the summer-house, as we ascended the steps to the door, was occupied by a young lady. She was standing near a rustic table, looking out at the inland view of moor and hill presented by a gap in the trees, and absently turning over the leaves of a little sketch-book that lay at her side. This was Miss Fairley. How can I describe her? How can I separate her from my own sensations, and from all that has happened in the later time? How can I see her again as she looked when my eyes first rested on her, as she should look now to the eyes that are about to see her in these pages? The water-colour drawing that I made of Laura Fairley at an after period, in the place and the attitude in which I first saw her, lies on my desk as I write. I look at it, and there dawns upon me brightly, from the dark greenish-brown background of the summer-house, a light, youthful figure, clothed in a simple muslin dress, the pattern of it formed by broad alternate stripes of delicate blue and white. A scarf of the same material sits crisply and closely round her shoulders, and a little straw hat of a natural colour, plainly and sparingly trimmed with ribbon to match the gown, covers her head, and throws its soft pearly shadow over the upper part of her face. Her hair is of so faint and pale a brown, not flaxen, and yet almost as light, not golden, and yet almost as glossy, that it nearly melts here and there into the shadow of the hat. It is plainly parted and then drawn back over her ears, and the line of it ripples naturally as it crosses her forehead. The eyebrows are rather darker than the hair, and the eyes are of that soft, limpid turquoise blue so often sung by poets, and so seldom seen in real life. Lovely eyes in colour, lovely eyes in form, large and tender and quietly thoughtful, but beautiful above all things in the clear truthfulness of the look that dwells in their inmost depths and shines through all their changes of expression with the light of a purer and a better world. The charm, most gently and yet most distinctly expressed, which they shed over the whole face, so covers and transforms its little natural human blemishes elsewhere, that it is difficult to estimate the relative merits and defects of the other features. It's hard to see that the lower part of the face is too delicately refined away towards the chin to be in full and fair proportion with the upper part, that the nose, in escaping the aquiline bend, always hard and cruel in a woman, no matter how abstractedly perfect it may be, has erred a little in the other extreme, and has missed the ideal straightness of line, and that the sweet, sensitive lips are subject to a slight nervous contraction when she smiles, which draws them upwards a little at one corner towards the cheek. It might be possible to note these blemishes in another woman's face, but it is not easy to dwell on them in hers, so subtly are they connected with all that is individual and characteristic in her expression, and so closely does the expression depend for its full play and life with every other feature on the moving impulse of the eyes. Does my poor portrait of her, my fond, patient labour of long and happy days, show me these things? Ah, how few of them there are in the dim mechanical drawing, and how many in the mind with which I regard it! A fair, delicate girl, in a pretty light dress, trifling with the leaves of a sketch-book, while she looks up from it with truthful, innocent blue eyes. That's all the drawing can say. all perhaps that even the deeper reach of thought and pen can say in their language either. The woman who first gives life, light, and form to our shadowy conceptions of beauty fill a void in our spiritual nature that has remained unknown to us till she appeared. Sympathies that lie too deep for words, too deep almost for thoughts, are touched at such times by other charms than those which the senses feel, and which the resource of expression can realize. The mystery which underlies the beauty of a woman is never raised above the reach of all expression until it has claimed kindred with the deeper mystery of our own souls. Then, and then only, has it passed beyond the narrow region on which light falls in this world, from the pencil and the pen. Think of her as you thought of the first woman who quickened the pulses within you that the rest of her sex had no art to stir. Let the kind, candid blue eyes meet yours, as they met mine, with the matchless look which we both remember so well. Let her voice speak the music that you once loved best, attuned as sweetly to your ear as to mine. Let her footstep as she comes and goes in these pages be like that other footstep to whose airy fall your own heart once beat time. Take her as the visionary nursling of your own fancy, and she will grow upon you all the more clearly as the living woman who dwells in mine. Among the sensations that crowded on me when my eyes first looked upon her, familiar sensations which we all know, which spring to life in most of our hearts, die away again in so many, and renew their bright existence in so few, there was one that troubled and perplexed me, one that seemed strangely inconsistent and unaccountably out of place in Miss Fairley's presence. Mingling with the vivid impression produced by the charm of her fair face and head, her sweet expression, and her winning simplicity of manner, was another impression, which in a shadowy way suggested to me the idea of something wanting. At one time it seemed like something wanting in her, at another like something wanting in myself, which hindered me from understanding her as I ought. The impression was always strongest in the most contradictory manner when she looked at me, or in other words, when I was most conscious of the harmony and charm of her face, and yet at the same time most troubled by the sense of incompleteness which it was impossible to discover. Something wanting, and where it was and what it was I could not say. The effect of this curious caprice of fancy, as I thought it then, was not of a nature to set me at my ease during the first interview with Miss Fairley. The few kind words of welcome which she spoke found me hardly self-possessed enough to thank her in the customary phrases of reply. Observing my hesitation, and no doubt attributing it, naturally enough, to some momentary shyness on my part, Miss Halcombe took the business of talking, as easily and readily as usual, into her own hands. "Look there, Mr. Hartright," she said, pointing to the sketch-book on the table, and to the little delicate wandering hand that was still trifling with it. "Surely you will acknowledge that your model pupil is found at last. The moment she hears that you are in the house, she seizes her inestimable sketch-book, looks universal nature straight in the face, and longs to begin." Miss Fairley laughed with a ready good humour, which broke out as brightly as if it had been part of the sunshine above us over her lovely face. "I must not take credit to myself where no credit is due," she said, her clear, truthful blue eyes looking alternately at Miss Holcombe and me. "Fond as I am of drawing, I was so conscious of my own ignorance that I am more afraid than anxious to begin. Now that you're here, Mr. Hartright, I find myself looking over my sketches as I used to look over my lessons when I was a little girl, when I was sadly afraid that I should turn out not fit to be heard." She made the confession very prettily and simply, and with quaint childish earnestness drew the sketch-book away close to her own side of the table. Miss Halcombe cut the knot of the little embarrassment forthwith in her resolute, downright way. "Good, bad, or indifferent," she said, "the pupil's sketches must pass through the fiery ordeal of the master's judgment, and there's an end of it. Suppose we take them with us in the carriage, Laura, and let Mr. Hartright see them for the first time under circumstances of perpetual jolting and interruption. If we can only confuse him all through the drive between nature as it is when he looks up at the view, and nature as it is not when he looks down again at our sketch-books, we shall drive him into the last desperate refuge of paying us compliments, and shall slip through his professional fingers with our pet feathers of vanity, all unruffled. "I hope Mr. Hartwright will pay me no compliments," said Miss Fairley, as we all left the summer-house. "May I venture to inquire why you express that hope?" I asked. "Because I shall believe all that you say to me," she answered simply. In those few words she unconsciously gave me the key to her whole character, to that generous trust in others which, in her nature, grew innocently out of the sense of her own truth. I only knew it intuitively then. I know it by experience now. We merely waited to rouse good Miss Vacy from the place which she still occupied at the deserted luncheon-table before we entered the open carriage for our promised drive. The old lady and Miss Halcombe occupied the back seat. Miss Fairley and I sat together in front, with the sketch-book open between us, fairly exhibited at last to my professional eyes. All serious criticism of the drawings, even if I had been disposed to volunteer it, was rendered impossible by Miss Halcombe's lively resolution to see nothing but the ridiculous side of the fine arts, as practised by herself, her sister, and ladies in general. I can remember the conversation that passed far more easily than the sketches that I mechanically looked over. That part of the talk especially, in which Miss Fairley took any share, is still as vividly impressed on my memory as if I had heard it only a few hours ago. Yes, let me acknowledge that this first day I let the charm of her presence lure me from the recollection of myself and my position. The most trifling of the questions that she put to me on the subject of using her pencil and mixing her colours, the slightest alterations of expression in the lovely eyes that looked into mine with such earnest desire to learn all that I could teach, and to discover all that I could show, attracted more of my attention than the finest view we passed through, or the grandest changes of light and shade, as they flowed into each other over the waving moorland and level beach. At any time, and under any circumstances of human interest, is it not strange to see how little real hold the objects of the natural world amid which we live can gain on our hearts and minds? We go to nature for comfort in trouble, and sympathy and joy only in books. Admiration of those beauties of the inanimate world which modern poetry so largely and so eloquently describes is not, even in the best of us, one of the original instincts of our nature. As children we none of us possess it. No uninstructed man or woman possesses it. Those whose lives are most exclusively passed amid the ever-changing wonders of sea and land are also those who are most universally insensible to every aspect of nature not directly associated with the human interest of their calling. Our capacity of appreciating the beauties of the earth we live on is, in truth, one of the civilized accomplishments which we all learn as an art. And more, that very capacity is rarely practised by any of us, except when our minds are most indolent and most unoccupied. How much share have the attractions of nature ever had in the pleasurable or painful interests and emotions of ourselves or our friends? What space do they ever occupy in the thousand little narratives of personal experience which pass every day by word of mouth from one of us to the other? All that our minds can compass, all that our hearts can learn, can be accomplished with equal certainty, equal profit, and equal satisfaction to ourselves in the poorest as in the richest prospect that the face of the earth can show. There is surely a reason for this want of inborn sympathy between the creature and the creation around it, a reason which may perhaps be found in the widely differing destinies of man and his earthly sphere. The grandest mountain prospect that the eye can range over is appointed to annihilation. The smallest human interest that the human heart can feel is appointed to immortality. We had been out nearly 3 hours when the carriage again passed through the gates of Limmeridge House. On our way back, I had let the ladies settle for themselves the first point of view which they were to sketch, under my instructions, on the afternoon of the next day. When they withdrew to dress for dinner, and when I was alone again in my little sitting-room, my spirits seemed to leave me all of a sudden. I felt ill at ease and dissatisfied with myself. I hardly knew why. Perhaps I was now conscious for the first time of having enjoyed our drive too much in the character of a guest, and too little in the character of a drawing-master. Perhaps that strange sense of something wanting, either in Miss Fairley or in myself, which had perplexed me when I first was introduced to her, haunted me still. Anyhow, it was a relief to my spirits when the dinner hour called me out of my solitude, and took me back to the society of the ladies of the house. I was struck on entering the drawing-room by the curious contrast, rather in material than in colour, of the dresses which they now wore. While Mrs. Vesey and Miss Halcombe were richly clad, each in the manner most becoming to her age, the first in silver grey, and the second in that delicate primrose yellow colour which matches so well with the dark complexion and black hair. Miss Fairley was unpretendingly and almost poorly dressed in plain white muslin. It was spotlessly pure. It was beautifully put on, but still it was the sort of dress which the wife or daughter of a poor man might have worn, and it made her, so far as externals went, look less affluent in circumstances than her own governess. At a later period, when I learnt to know more of Miss Fairley's character, I discovered that this curious contrast on the wrong side was due to her natural delicacy of feeling and natural intensity of aversion to the slightest personal display of her own wealth. Neither Mrs. Vesey nor Miss Halcombe could ever induce her to let the advantage in dress desert the two ladies who were poor, to lean to the side of the one lady who was rich. When the dinner was over, we returned together to the drawing-room. Although Mr. Fairley, emulating the magnificent condescension of the monarch who had picked up Titian's brush for him, had instructed his butler to consult my wishes in relation to the wine which I might prefer after dinner, I was resolute enough to resist the temptation of sitting in solitary grandeur among bottles of my own choosing, and sensible enough to ask the ladies' permission to leave the table with them habitually, on the civilized foreign plan, during the period of my residence at Limmeridge House. The drawing-room, to which we had now withdrawn for the rest of the evening, was on the ground floor, and was of the same shape and size as the breakfast-room. Large glass doors at the lower end opened on to the terrace, beautifully ornamented along its whole length with a profusion of flowers. The soft, hazy twilight was just shading leaf and blossom alike into harmony with its own sombre hues as we entered the room, and the sweet evening scent of the flowers met us with its fragrant welcome through the open glass doors. Good Mrs. Vesey, always the first of the party to sit down, took possession of an arm-chair in a corner, and dozed off comfortably to sleep. At my request, Miss Fairley placed herself at the piano. As I followed her to a seat near the instrument, I saw Miss Halcombe retire into a recess of one of the side windows, to proceed with a search through her mother's letters by the last rays of the evening light. How vividly that peaceful home picture of the drawing-room comes back to me while I write. From the place where I sat, I could see Miss Halcombe's graceful figure, half of it in soft light, half in mysterious shadow, bending intently over the letters in her lap, while nearer to me the fair profile of the player at the piano was just delicately defined against the faintly deepening background of the inner wall of the room. Outside on the terrace, the clustering flowers and long grasses and creepers waved so gently in the light evening air that the sound of their rustling never reached us. The sky was without a cloud, and the dawning mystery of moonlight began to tremble already in the region of the eastern heaven. The sense of peace and seclusion soothed all thought and feeling into a rapt, unearthly repose, and the balmy quiet that deepened ever with the deepening light seemed to hover over us in a gentler influence still, when there stole upon it from the piano the heavenly tenderness of the music of Mozart. It was an evening of sights and sounds never to forget. We all sat silent in the places we'd chosen, Mrs. Vesey still sleeping, Miss Fairley still playing, Miss Halcombe still reading, till the light failed us. By this time the moon had stolen round to the terrace, and soft, mysterious rays of light were slanting already across the lower end of the room. The change from the twilight obscurity was so beautiful that we banished the lamps by common consent when the servant brought them in, and kept the large room unlighted, except by the glimmer of the 2 candles at the piano. For half an hour more the music still went on. After that the beauty of the moonlight view on the terrace tempted Miss Fairley out to look at it, and I followed her. When the candles at the piano had been lighted, Miss Halcombe had changed her place so as to continue her examination of the letters with their assistance. We left her on a low chair at one side of the instrument, so absorbed over her reading that she did not seem to notice when we moved. We had been out on the terrace together, just in front of the glass doors, hardly so long as 5 minutes, I should think, and Miss Fairley was, by my advice, just tying her white handkerchief over her head as a precaution against the night air, when I heard Miss Halcombe's voice, low, eager, and altered from its natural lively tone, pronounce my name. "Mr. Hartright," she said, "will you come here for a minute? I want to speak to you." I entered the room immediately. The piano stood about halfway down along the inner wall. On the side of the instrument furthest from the terrace, Miss Halcombe was sitting with the letters scattered on her lap, and with one hand she selected from them and held close to the candle. On the side nearest to the terrace there stood a low ottoman, on which I took my place. In this position I was not far from the glass doors, and I could see Miss Fairley plainly, as she passed and repassed the opening on the terrace, walking slowly from end to end of it in the full radiance of the moon. I want you to listen while I read the concluding passages in this letter," said Miss Halcombe. "Tell me if you think they throw any light upon your strange adventure on the road to London. The letter is addressed by my mother to her second husband, Mr. Fairley, and the date refers to a period between 11 and 12 years since. At that time Mr. and Mrs. Fairley and my half-sister Laura had been living for years in this house. I was away from them, completing my education at a school in Paris." She looked and spoke earnestly, and, as I thought, a little uneasily as well. At the moment when she raised the letter to the candle before beginning to read it, Miss Fairley passed us on the terrace, looked in for a moment, and seeing that we were engaged, slowly walked on. Miss Halcombe began to read as follows: "You will be tired, my dear Philip, of hearing perpetually about my schools and my scholars. Lay the blame, pray, on the dull uniformity of life at Limmeridge, and not on me. Besides, this time I have something really interesting to tell you about a new scholar. You know old Mrs. Kemp at the village shop? Well, after years of ailing, the doctor has at last given her up, and she's dying slowly, day by day. Her only living relation, a sister, arrived last week to take care of her. This sister comes all the way from Hampshire. Her name is Mrs. Catherick. 4 days ago, Mrs. Catherick came here to see me, and brought her only child with her, a sweet little girl about a year older than our darling Laura." As the last sentence fell from the reader's lips, Miss Fairley passed us on the terrace once more. She was softly singing to herself one of the melodies which she had been playing earlier in the evening. Miss Halcombe waited until she had passed out of sight again, and then went on with the letter. "Mrs. Catherick is a decent, well-behaved, respectable woman, middle-aged, and with the remains of having been only moderately, nice-looking. There is something in her manner and her appearance, however, which I can't make out. She is reserved about herself to the point of downright secrecy, and there is a look in her face, I can't describe it, which suggests to me that she has something on her mind. She is altogether what you would call a walking mystery. Her errand at Limmeridge House, however, was simple enough. When she left Hampshire to nurse her sister, Mrs. Kemp, through her last illness, she had been obliged to bring her daughter with her, through having no one at home to take care of the little girl. Mrs. Kemp may die in a week's time, or may linger on for months, and Mrs. Catherick's object was to ask me to let her daughter, Anne, have the benefit of attending my school, subject to the condition of her being removed from it to go home again with her mother after Mrs. Kemp's death. I consented at once, and when Laura and I went out for our walk, we took the little girl, who is just 11 years old, to the school that very day." Once more Miss Fairley's figure, bright and soft in its snowy muslin dress, her face prettily framed by the white folds of the handkerchief which she had tied under her chin, passed by us in the moonlight. Once more Miss Halcombe waited till she was out of sight, and then went on. "I have taken a violent fancy, Philip, to my new scholar, for a reason which I mean to keep to the last, for the sake of surprising you. Her mother having told me as little about the child as she told me about herself, I was left to discover, which I did on the very first day when we tried her at lessons, that the poor little thing's intellect is not developed as it ought to be at her age. Seeing this, I had her up at the house the next day, and privately arranged with the doctor to come and watch her and question her, and tell me what he thought. His opinion is that she will grow out of it, but he says her careful bringing up at school is a matter of great importance just now, because her unusual slowness in acquiring ideas implies an unusual tenacity in keeping them when they are once received into her mind. Now, my love, you must not imagine in your off-hand way that I have been attaching myself to an idiot. This poor little Anne Catherick is a sweet, affectionate, grateful girl, and says the quaintest, prettiest things, as you shall judge by an instance, in the most oddly sudden, surprised, half-frightened way. Although she's dressed very neatly, her clothes show a sad want of taste in colour and pattern. So I arranged yesterday that some of our darling Laura's old white frocks and white hats should be altered for Anne Catherick, explaining to her that little girls of her complexion look neater and prettier all in white than in anything else. She hesitated and seemed puzzled for a minute, then flushed up and appeared to understand. Her little hand clasped mine suddenly. She kissed it, Philip, and said, oh, so earnestly, "I will always wear white as long as I live. It will help me to remember you, ma'am, and to think that I am pleasing you still, when I go away and see you no more." This is only one specimen of the quaint things she says so prettily. Poor little soul! She shall have a stock of white frocks, made with good deep tucks, to let out for her as she grows. Miss Halcombe paused and looked at me across the piano. "Did the forlorn woman whom you met on the high road seem young?" she asked. "Young enough to be 2 or 3 and 20? "Yes, Miss Halcombe, as young as that." "And she was strangely dressed from head to foot, all in white?" "All in white." While the answer was passing my lips, Miss Fairley glided into view on the terrace for the third time. Instead of proceeding on her walk, she stopped, with her back turned towards us, and, leaning on the balustrade of the terrace, looked down into the garden beyond. My eyes fixed on the white gleam of her muslin gown and head-dress in the moonlight, and a sensation, for which I can find no name, a sensation that quickened my pulse and raised a fluttering in my heart, began to steal over me. "All in white," Miss Halcombe repeated. "The most important sentences in the letter, Mr. Hartwright, are those at the end, which I will read to you immediately. But I can't help dwelling a little upon the coincidence of a white costume of the woman you met, and the white frocks which produced that strange answer from my mother's little scholar. The doctor may have been wrong when he discovered the child's defects of intellect, and predicted that she would grow out of them. She may never have grown out of them, and the old grateful fancy about dressing in white, which was a serious feeling to the girl, may be a serious feeling to the woman still." I said a few words in answer, I hardly know what. All my attention was concentrated on the white gleam of Miss Fairley's muslin dress. "Listen to the last sentences of the letter," said Miss Halcombe. "I think they'll surprise you." As she raised the letter to the light of the candle, Miss Fairley turned from the balustrade, looked doubtfully up and down the terrace, advanced a step towards the glass doors, and then stopped, facing us. Meanwhile, Miss Halcombe read me the last sentences to which she had referred. "And now, my love, seeing that I am at the end of my paper, now for the real reason, the surprising reason, for my fondness for little Anne Catherick. My dear Philip, although she's not half so pretty, she is, nevertheless, by one of those extraordinary caprices of accidental resemblance which one sometimes sees, the living likeness in her hair, her complexion, the colour of her eyes, and the shape of her face." I started from the ottoman before Miss Halcombe could pronounce the next words. A thrill of the same feeling which ran through me when the touch was laid upon my shoulder on that lonely high road chilled me again. There stood Miss Fairley, a white figure, alone in the moonlight, in her attitude, in the turn of her head, in her complexion, in the shape of her face, the living image, at that distance and under those circumstances, of the woman in white. The doubt which had troubled my mind for hours and hours past flashed into conviction in an instant. That something wanting was my own recognition of the luminous likeness between the fugitive from the asylum and my pupil at Limmeridge House. "You see it?" said Miss Halcombe. She dropped the useless letter, and her eyes flashed as they met mine. "You see it now, as my mother saw it 11 years since." "I see it more unwillingly than I can say. To associate that forlorn, friendless, lost woman, even by an accidental likeness only, with Miss Fairley, seems like casting a shadow on the future of the bright creature who stands looking at us now. Let me lose the impression again as soon as possible. Call her in, out of the dreary moonlight. Pray call her in." "Mr. Hartright, you surprise me. Whatever women may be, I thought that men in the 19th century were above superstition." "Pray call her in." "Hush, hush. She's coming of her own accord. Say nothing in her presence. Let this discovery of the likeness be kept a secret between you and me. Come in, Laura, come in. And wake Mrs. Vasey at the piano. Mr. Hartright is petitioning for some more music, and he wants it this time to be of the lightest and liveliest kind." 9. So ended my eventful first day at Limmeridge House. Miss Halcombe and I kept our secret. After the discovery of the likeness, no fresh light seemed destined to break over the mystery of the woman in white. At the first safe opportunity, Miss Halcombe cautiously led her half-sister to speak of her mother, of old times, of Anne Catherick. Miss Fairley's recollections of the little scholar at Limmeridge were, however, only of the vague and general kind. She remembered the likeness between herself and her mother's favourite pupil as something which had been supposed to exist in past times, but she did not refer to the gift of the white dresses, or to the singular form of words in which the child had artlessly expressed her gratitude for them. She remembered that Anne had remained at Limmeridge for a few months only, and had then left it to go back to her home in Hampshire, but she could not say whether the mother and daughter had ever returned, or had ever been heard of afterwards. No further search on Miss Halcombe's part through the few letters of Mrs. Fairley's writing which she had left unread assisted in clearing up the uncertainties still left to perplex us. We had identified the unhappy woman whom I had met in the night time with Anne Catherick. We had made some advance, at least, towards connecting the probably defective condition of the poor creature's intellect with the peculiarity of her being dressed all in white, and with the continuance in her maturer years of her childish gratitude towards Mrs. Fairley. And there, so far as we knew at that time, our discoveries had ended. The days passed on, the weeks passed on, and the track of the golden autumn wound its bright way visibly through the green summer of the trees. Peaceful, fast-flowing, happy time. My story glides by you now, as swiftly as you once glided by me. Of all the treasures of enjoyment that you poured so freely into my heart, how much is left me that has purpose and value enough to be written on this page? Nothing but the saddest of all confessions that a man can make, the confession of his own folly. The secret which that confession discloses should be told with little effort, for it has indirectly escaped me already. The poor weak words which have failed to describe Miss Fairley have succeeded in betraying the sensations she awakened in me. It is so with us all. Our words are giants when they do us an injury, and dwarfs when they do us a service. I loved her. Ah, how well I know all the sadness and all the mockery that's contained in those 3 words. I can sigh over my mournful confession with the tenderest woman who reads it and pities me. I can laugh at it as bitterly as the hardest man who tosses it from him in contempt. I loved her. Feel for me, or despise me, I confess it with the same immovable resolution to own the truth. Was there no excuse for me? There was some excuse to be found, surely, in the conditions under which my term of hired service was passed at Limmeridge House. My morning hours succeeded each other calmly in the quiet and seclusion of my own room. I had just enough work to do in mounting my employer's drawings to keep my hands and eyes pleasurably employed, while my mind was left free to enjoy the dangerous luxury of its own unbridled thoughts. A perilous solitude, for it lasted long enough to enervate, not long enough to fortify me. A perilous solitude, for it was followed by afternoons and evenings spent day after day and week after week alone in the society of two women, one of whom possessed all the accomplishments of grace, wit, and high breeding, and the other all the charms of beauty, gentleness, and simple truth that can purify and subdue the heart of man. Not a day passed in that dangerous intimacy of teacher and pupil in which my hand was not close to Miss Fairley's, my cheek, as we bent together over her sketch-book, almost touching hers. The more attentively she watched every movement of my brush, the more closely I was breathing the perfume of her hair and the warm fragrance of her breath. It was part of my service to live in the very light of her eyes. At one time, to be bending over her, so close to her bosom as to tremble at the thought of touching it. At another, to feel her bending over me, bending so close to see what I was about, that her voice sank low when she spoke to me, and her ribbons brushed my cheek in the wind before she could draw them back. The evenings which followed the sketching excursions of the afternoon varied rather than checked these innocent, these inevitable familiarities. My natural fondness for the music which she played with such tender feeling, such delicate womanly taste, and her natural enjoyment of giving me back, by the practice of her art, the pleasure which I had offered her by the practice of mine, only wove another tie which drew us closer and closer to one another. The accidents of conversation, the simple habits which regulated even such a little thing as the position of our places at table, the play of Miss Halcombe's ever-ready raillery, always directed against my anxiety as teacher, while it sparkled over her enthusiasm as pupil, the harmless expression of poor Mrs. Vace's drowsy approval, which connected Miss Fairley and me as two model young people who never disturbed her, every one of these trifles and many more combined to fold us together in the same domestic atmosphere, and to lead us both insensibly to the same hopeless end. I should have remembered my position, and put myself secretly on my guard. I did so, but not till it was too late. All the discretion, all the experience which had availed me with other women, and secured me against other temptations, failed me with her. It had been my profession for years past to be in this close contact with young girls of all ages, and of all orders of beauty. I had accepted the position as part of my calling in life, and had trained myself to leave all the sympathies natural to my age in my employer's outer hall, as coolly as I left my umbrella there before I went upstairs. I had long since learnt to understand, composedly, and as a matter of course, that my situation in life was considered a guarantee against any of my female pupils feeling more than the most ordinary interest in me, and that I was admitted among beautiful and captivating women much as a harmless domestic animal is admitted among them. This guardian experience I had gained early. This guardian experience had sternly and strictly guided me straight along my own poor narrow path, without once letting me stray aside, to the right hand or to the left. And now I and my trusty talisman were parted for the first time. Yes, my hardly earned self-control was as completely lost to me as if I had never possessed it. Lost to me, as it is lost every day to other men, in other critical situations where women are concerned. I know now that I should have questioned myself from the first. I should have asked why any room in the house was better than home to me when she entered it, and barren as a desert when she went out again. Why I always noticed and remembered the little changes in her dress that I'd noticed and remembered in no other woman's before. Why I saw her, heard her, and touched her when we shook hands at night and morning, as I had never seen, heard, and touched any other woman in my life. I should have looked into my own heart, and found this new growth springing there, and plucked it out while it was young. Why was this easiest, simplest work of self-culture always too much for me? The explanation has been written already in the 3 words that were many enough and plain enough for my confession. I loved her. The days passed. The weeks passed. It was approaching the 3rd month of my stay in Cumberland. The delicious monotony of life in our calm seclusion flowed on with me, like a smooth stream with a swimmer who glides down the current. All memory of the past, all thought of the future, all sense of the falseness and hopelessness of my own position lay hushed within me into deceitful rest, lulled by the siren song that my own heart sung to me. With eyes shut to all sight and ears closed to all sound of danger, I drifted nearer and nearer to the fatal rocks. The warning that aroused me at last and startled me into sudden, self-accusing consciousness of my own weakness was the plainest, the truest, the kindest of all warnings, for it came silently from her. We had parted one night as usual. No word had fallen from my lips at that time or any time before it that could betray me or startle her into sudden knowledge of the truth. But when we met again in the morning, a change had come over her, a change that told me all. I shrank then. I shrink still from invading the innermost sanctuary of her heart and laying it open to others, as I have laid open my own. Let it be enough to say that the time when she first surprised my secret was, I firmly believe, the time when she first surprised her own, and the time also when she changed towards me in the interval of one night. Her nature, too truthful to deceive others, was too noble to deceive itself. When the doubt that I had hushed to sleep first laid its weary weight on her heart, the true face owned all, and said in its own frank, simple language, "I'm sorry for him. I'm sorry for myself." It said this, and more, which I could not then interpret. I understood but too well the change in her manner, to greater kindness and quicker readiness in interpreting all my wishes before others, to constraint and sadness and nervous anxiety to absorb herself in the first occupation she could seize on, whenever we happened to be left together alone. I understood why the sweet, sensitive lips smiled so rarely and so restrainedly now, and why the clear blue eyes looked at me, sometimes with the pity of an angel, sometimes with the innocent perplexity of a child. But the change meant more than this. There was a coldness in her hand. There was an unnatural immobility in her face. There was in all her movements the mute expression of constant fear and clinging self-reproach. The sensations that I could trace to herself and to me, the unacknowledged sensations that we were feeling in common, were not these. There were certain elements of the change in her that were still secretly drawing us together, and others that were as secretly beginning to drive us apart. In my doubt and perplexity, in my vague suspicion of something hidden, which I was left to find by my own unaided efforts, I examined Miss Halcombe's looks and manner for enlightenment. Living in such intimacy as ours, no serious alteration could take place in any one of us, which did not sympathetically affect the others. The change in Miss Fairlie was reflected in her half-sister. Although not a word escaped Miss Halcombe which hinted at an altered state of feeling towards myself, her penetrating eyes had contracted a new habit of always watching me. Sometimes the look was like suppressed anger, sometimes like suppressed dread, sometimes like neither, like nothing, in short, which I could understand. A week elapsed, leaving us all three still in this position of secret constraint towards one another. My situation, aggravated by the sense of my own miserable weakness and forgetfulness of myself, now too late awakened in me, was becoming intolerable. I felt that I must cast off the oppression under which I was living, at once and for ever, and yet how to act for the best, or what to say first, was more than I could tell. From this position of helplessness and humiliation I was rescued by Miss Halcombe. Her lips told me the bitter, the necessary, the unexpected truth. Her hearty kindness sustained me under the shock of hearing it. Her sense and courage turned to its right use an event which threatened the worst that could happen to me and to others in Limmeridge House.
End of Track 3. The Woman in White. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Woman in White by Wilkie Collins. Read by
Tim Bulkley of BigBible.org.
Anne Catherick, read by Iswa.
Track 4.
The First Epoch. 10. It was on a Thursday in the week, and nearly the end of the 3rd month of my sojourn in Cumberland. In the morning, when I went down into the breakfast-room at the usual hour, Miss Halcombe, for the first time since I'd known her, was absent from her customary place at the table. Miss Fairley was out on the lawn. She bowed to me, but did not come in. Not a word had dropped from my lips or from hers that would unsettle either of us. Yet the same unacknowledged sense of embarrassment made us shrink alike from meeting one another alone. She waited on the lawn, and I waited in the breakfast-room, until Mrs. Vasey or Miss Halcombe came in. How quickly I should have joined her, how readily we should have shaken hands and glided into our customary talk, only a fortnight ago. In a few minutes Miss Halcombe entered. She had a preoccupied look, and she made her apologies for being late rather absently. "I've been detained," she said, "by a consultation with Mr. Fairley on a domestic matter, which he wished to speak to me about." Miss Fairley came in from the garden, and the usual morning greeting passed between us. Her hand struck colder to mine than ever. She did not look at me, and she was very pale. Even Mrs. Vasey noticed it when she entered the room a moment after. "I suppose it's the change in the wind," said the old lady. "The winter is coming. Ah, my love, the winter is coming soon." In her heart and in mine it had come already. Our morning meal, once so full of pleasant, good-humoured discussion of the plans of the day, was short and silent. Miss Fairley seemed to feel the oppression of the long pauses in the conversation, and looked appealingly to her sister to fill them up. Miss Halcombe, after once or twice hesitating and checking herself, in a most uncharacteristic manner, spoke at last. "I've seen your uncle this morning, Laura," she said. "He thinks the purple room is the one that ought to be got ready, and he confirms what I told you. Monday is the day, not Tuesday." While these words were being spoken, Miss Fairley looked down at the table beneath her. Her fingers moved nervously among the crumbs that were scattered on the cloth. The paleness of her cheeks spread to her lips, and the lips themselves trembled visibly. I was not the only person present who noticed this. Miss Halcombe saw it too, and at once set us the example of rising from the table. Mrs. Vasey and Miss Fairley left the room together. The kind, sorrowful blue eyes looked at me for a moment, with the prescient sadness of a coming and a long farewell. I felt the answering pang in my own heart, the pang that told me I must lose her soon, and love her the more unchangeably for the loss. I turned towards the garden, when the door had closed on her. Miss Halcombe was standing with her hat in her hand and her shawl over her arm by the large window that led out to the lawn, and was looking at me attentively. "Have you any leisure time to spare," she asked, "before you begin to work in your own room?" "Certainly, Miss Halcombe. I have always time at your service." "I want to say a word to you in private, Mr. Hartwright. Get your hat and come out into the garden. We're not likely to be disturbed there at this hour of the morning." As we stepped out onto the lawn, one of the under gardeners, a mere lad, passed us on his way to the house with a letter in his hand. Miss Halcombe stopped him. "Is that letter for me?" she asked. "Nay, miss. It's just said to be for Miss Fairley," answered the lad, holding out the letter as he spoke. Miss Halcombe took it from him and looked at the address. Strange handwriting, she said to herself. Who can Laura's correspondent be? Where did you get this? She continued, addressing the gardener. Well, miss, said the lad, I got it from a woman. What woman? A woman well stricken in age. Ah, an old woman. Anyone you knew? I cannot tak it on mysel' to say that she was other than a stranger to me. Which way did she go? That gate, said the under gardener, turning with great deliberation towards the south, and embracing the whole of that part of England with one comprehensive sweep of his arm. Curious, said Miss Halcombe. I suppose it must be a begging letter. There, she added, handing the letter back to the lad. Take it to the house and give it to one of the servants. Now, Mr. Hartright, if you've no objection, let's walk this way. She led me across the lawn, along the same path by which I had followed her on the day after my arrival at Limmeridge. At the little summer-house in which Laura Fairley and I had first seen each other, she stopped and broke the silence which she had steadily maintained while we were walking together. What I have to say to you I can say here. With those words she entered the summer-house, took one of the chairs at the little round table inside, and signed to me to take the other. I suspected what was coming when she spoke to me in the breakfast-room. I felt certain of it now. Mr. Hartright, she said, I'm going to begin by making a frank avowal to you. I'm going to say, without phrase-mating, which I detest, or paying compliments, which I heartily despise, that I've come in the course of your residence with us to feel a strong friendly regard for you. I was predisposed in your favour when you first told me of your conduct towards that unhappy woman whom you met under such remarkable circumstances. Your management of the affair might not have been prudent, but it showed the self-control, the delicacy, and the compassion of a man who was naturally a gentleman. Made me expect good things from you, and you have not disappointed my expectations. She paused, but held up her hand at the same time as a sign that she awaited no answer from me before she proceeded. When I entered the summer-house, no thought was in me of the woman in white. But now Miss Halcombe's own words had put the memory of my adventure back in my mind. It remained there throughout the interview. Remained, and not without a result. As your friend, she proceeded, I'm going to tell you at once, in my own plain, blunt, downright language, that I've discovered your secret, without help or hint, mind, from anyone else. Mr. Hartright, you have thoughtlessly allowed yourself to form an attachment, a serious and devoted attachment, I am afraid, to my sister Laura. I don't put you to the pain of confessing it in so many words, because I see and know that you are too honest to deny it. I don't even blame you. I pity you for opening your heart to a hopeless affection. You have not attempted to take any underhand advantage. You have not spoken to my sister in secret. You are guilty of weakness and want of attention to your own best interests, but of nothing worse. If you had acted in any single respect less delicately and less modestly, I should have told you to leave the house without an instant's notice, or an instant's consultation of anybody. As it is, I blame the misfortune of your years and your position. I don't blame you. Shake hands. I've given you pain. I'm going to give you more. But there is no help for it. Shake hands with your friend Marian Halcombe first. The sudden kindness, the warm, high-minded, fearless sympathy which met me on such mercifully equal terms, which appealed with such delicate and generous abruptness straight to my heart, my honour and my courage, overcame me in an instant. I tried to look at her when she took my hand, but my eyes were dim. I tried to thank her, but my voice failed me. Listen to me, she said, considerately avoiding all notice of my loss of self-control. Listen to me, and let us get it over with at once. It is a real true relief to me that I am not obliged, in what I have to say now, to enter into the question, the hard and cruel question, as I think of it, of social inequalities. Circumstances which will try you to the quick spare me the ungracious necessity of paining a man who has lived in friendly intimacy under the same roof with myself by any humiliating references to matters of rank and station. You must leave Limmeridge House, Mr. Hartright, before any more harm is done. It is my duty to say that to you, and it would be equally my duty to say it under precisely the same serious necessity if you were the representative of the oldest and wealthiest family in England. You must leave us, not because you are a teacher of drawing." She waited a moment, turned her face full on me, and, reaching across the table, laid her hand firmly on my arm. "Not because you are a teacher of drawing," she repeated, "but because Laura Fairley is engaged to be married." The last word went like a bullet to my heart. My arm lost all sensation of the hand that grasped it. I never moved and never spoke. The sharp autumn breeze that scattered the dead leaves at our feet came as cold to me on a sudden as if my own mad hopes were dead leaves too, whirled away by the wind like the rest. Hopes. Betrothed or not betrothed, she was equally far from me. Would other men have remembered that in my place? Not if they'd loved her as I did. The pang passed, and nothing but the dull, numbing pain of it remained. I felt Miss Halcombe's hand again, tightening its hold on my arm. I raised my head and looked at her. Her large black eyes were rooted on me, watching the white change on my face, which I felt and which she saw. "Crush it," she said. "Here, where you first saw her, crush it. Don't shrink under it like a woman. Tear it out. Trample it underfoot like a man." The suppressed vehemence with which she spoke, the strength which her will concentrated in the look she fixed on me, and in the hold on my arm that she had not yet relinquished, communicated to mine, steadied me. We both waited for a minute in silence. At the end of that time I had justified her generous faith in my manhood. I had, outwardly at least, recovered my self-control. "Are you yourself again?" "Enough myself, Miss Halcombe, to ask your pardon and hers. Enough myself to be guided by your advice, and to prove my gratitude in that way, if I can prove it in no other." "You've proved it already," she answered, "by those words, Mr. Hartright. Concealment is at an end between us. I cannot affect to hide from you what my sister has unconsciously shown to me. You must leave us for her sake as well as for your own. Your presence here, your necessary intimacy with us, harmless as it has been, God knows, in all other respects, has unsteadied her and made her wretched. I, who love her better than I love my own life, I, who have learnt to believe in that pure, noble, innocent nature as I believe in my religion, know but too well the secret misery of self-reproach that she has been suffering since the first shadow of a feeling disloyal to her marriage engagement entered her heart in spite of her. I don't say, it will be useless to attempt to say it after what has happened, that her engagement has ever had strong hold on her affections. It is an engagement of honour, not of love. Her father sanctioned it on his deathbed 2 years since. She herself neither welcomed it nor shrank from it. She was content to make it. Till you came here, she's been in the position of hundreds of other women who marry men without being greatly attracted to them or greatly repelled by them, and who learn to love them, when they don't learn to hate, after marriage instead of before. I hope more earnestly than words can say, and you should have the self-sacrificing courage to hope too, that the new thoughts and feelings which have disturbed the old calmness and the old content have not taken root too deeply to be ever removed. Your absence, if I had less belief in your honour and your courage and your sense, I should not trust to them as I am trusting now. Your absence will help my efforts, and time will help us all three. It is something to know that my first confidence in you was not all misplaced. It is something to know that you will not be less honest, less manly, less considerate towards the pupil whose relation to yourself you have had the misfortune to forget, than towards the stranger and the outcast whose appeal to you was not made in vain. Again, the chance reference to the woman in white. There was no possibility of speaking of Miss Fairley and of me without raising the memory of Anne Catherick, and setting her between us, like a fatality that it was hopeless to avoid. "Tell me what apology I can make to Mr. Fairley for breaking my engagement," I said. "Tell me when to go after that apology is accepted. I promise implicit obedience to you and to your advice." "Time is every way of importance," she answered. "You heard me refer this morning to Monday next, and to the necessity of setting the Purple Room in order. The visitor whom we expect on Monday—" I could not wait for her to be more explicit. Knowing what I knew now, the memory of Miss Fairley's look and manner at the breakfast table told me that the expected visitor at Limmeridge House was her future husband. I tried to force it back, but something rose within me at that moment stronger than my own will, and I interrupted Miss Halcombe. "Let me go to-day," I said bitterly. "The sooner the better." "No, not to-day," she replied. "The only reason you can assign to Mr. Fairley for your departure before the end of your engagement must be that an unforeseen necessity compels you to ask his permission to return at once to London. You must wait until to-morrow to tell him that, at the time when the post comes in, because he will then understand the sudden change in your plans by associating it with the arrival of a letter from London. It is miserable and sickening to descend to deceit, even of the most harmless kind, but I know Mr. Fairley, and if you once excite his suspicions that you are trifling with him, he will refuse to release you. Speak to him on Friday morning. Occupy yourself afterwards, for the sake of your own interests with your employer, in leaving your unfinished work in as little confusion as possible, and quit this place on Saturday. It will be time enough then, Mr. Hartwright, for you and for all of us." Before I could assure her that she might depend on my acting in the strictest accordance with her wishes, we were both startled by advancing footsteps in the shrubbery. Someone was coming from the house to seek for us. I felt the blood rush to my cheeks and then leave them again. Could the third person, who was fast approaching us at such a time and under such circumstances, be Miss Fairley? It was a relief. So sadly, so hopelessly was my position towards her changed already, it was absolutely a relief to me when the person who disturbed us appeared at the entrance of the summer-house, and proved to be only Miss Fairley's maid. "Could I speak with you a moment, miss?" said the girl, in a rather flurried, unsettled manner. Miss Halcombe descended the steps into the shrubbery, and walked aside a few paces with the maid. Left by myself, my mind reverted with a sense of forlorn wretchedness which it is not in any words that I can find to describe, to my approaching return to the solitude and the despair of my lonely London home. Thoughts of my kind old mother and of my sister, who had rejoiced with her so innocently over my prospects in Cumberland, thoughts whose long banishment from my heart it was now my shame and my reproach to realize for the first time, came back to me with the loving mournfulness of old neglected friends. My mother and my sister. What would they feel when I returned to them from my broken engagement with the confession of my miserable secret? They who had parted from me so hopefully on that last happy night in the Hampstead cottage. Anne Catherick again. Even the memory of the farewell evening with my mother and my sister could not return to me now unconnected with that other memory of the moonlit walk back to London. What did it mean? Were that woman and I to meet once more? It was possible, at the least. Did she know that I lived in London? Yes, I'd told her so, either before or after that strange question of hers, when she'd asked me so distrustfully if I knew many men of the rank of baronet. Either before or after. My mind was not calm enough then to remember which. A few minutes elapsed before Miss Halcombe dismissed the maid and came back to me. She, too, looked flurried and unsettled now. "We've arranged all that's necessary, Mr. Hartwright," she said. "We've understood each other as friends should, and we may go back to the house at once. To tell the truth, I'm uneasy about Laura. She's sent to say she wants to see me directly, and the maid reports that her mistress is apparently very much agitated by a letter that she's received this morning. The same letter, no doubt, which I sent on to the house before we came here." We retraced our steps together hastily along the shrubbery path. Although Miss Halcombe had ended all that she thought it necessary to say on her side, I had not ended all that I wanted to say on mine. From the moment when I had discovered that the unexpected visitor at Limmeridge was Miss Fairlie's future husband, I had felt a bitter curiosity, a burning, envious eagerness to know who he was. It was possible that a future opportunity of putting the question might not easily offer, so I risked asking it on our way back to the house. "Now that you're kind enough to tell me we have understood each other, Miss Halcombe," I said, "now that you are sure of my gratitude for your forbearance and my obedience to your wishes, may I venture to ask who—" I hesitated. I had forced myself to think of him, but it was harder still to speak of him as her promised husband. "Who the gentleman engaged to Miss Fairlie is?" Her mind was evidently occupied with the message she had received from her sister. She answered in a hasty, absent way, "A gentleman with a large property in Hampshire." Hampshire? Anne Catherick's native place. Again and yet again the woman in white. There was a fatality in it. "And his name?" I said, as quietly and indifferently as I could. "Sir Percival Glyde." "Sir Percival?" Anne Catherick's question, that suspicious question about the men of the rank of baronet whom I might happen to know, had hardly been dismissed from my mind by Miss Halcombe's return to me in the summer house before it was recalled again by her own answer. I stopped suddenly and looked at her. "Sir Percival Glyde," she repeated, imagining that I had not heard her former reply. "Knight or baronet?" I asked, with an agitation that I could hide no longer. She paused for a moment, and then answered rather coldly, "Baronet, of course." 11. Not a word more was said on either side as we walked back to the house. Miss Halcombe hastened immediately to her sister's room, and I withdrew to my studio to set in order all Mr. Fairlie's drawings that I had not yet mounted and restored before I resigned them to the care of other hands. Thoughts that I had hitherto restrained, thoughts that made my position harder than ever to endure, crowded on me now that I was alone. She was engaged to be married, and her future husband was Sir Percival Glyde, a man of the rank of baronet, and the owner of property in Hampshire. There were hundreds of baronets in England and dozens of landowners in Hampshire. Judging by the ordinary rules of evidence, I had not the shadow of a reason thus far for connecting Sir Percival Glyde with the suspicious words of inquiry that had been spoken to me by the woman in white. And yet I did connect him with them. It was because he had now become associated in my mind with Miss Fairlie, Miss Fairlie being in her turn associated with Anne Catherick, since the night when I had discovered the ominous likeness between them. Had the events of the morning so unnerved me already that I was at the mercy of any delusion which common chances and common coincidences might suggest to my imagination? Impossible to say. I could only feel that what had passed between Miss Halcombe and myself on our way from the summer house had affected me very strangely. The foreboding of some undiscoverable danger lying hid from us all in the darkness of the future was strong on me. The doubt whether I was not linked already to a chain of events which even my approaching departure from Cumberland would be powerless to snap asunder, the doubt whether we any of us saw the end as the end would really be, gathered more and more darkly over my mind. Poignant as it was, the sense of suffering caused by the miserable end of my brief, presumptuous love seemed to be blunted and deadened by the still stronger sense of something obscurely impending, something invisibly threatening, that time was holding over our heads. I had been engaged with the drawings little more than half an hour when there was a knock at the door. It opened on my answering, and to my surprise Miss Halcombe entered the room. Her manner was angry and agitated. She caught up a chair for herself before I could give her one, and sat down in it close to my side. "Mr. Hartright," she said, "I hope that all painful subjects of conversation were exhausted between us for to-day at least, but it is not to be so. There is some underhand villainy at work to frighten my sister about her approaching marriage. You saw me send the gardener on to the house with a letter addressed in a strange handwriting to Miss Fairley. Certainly. The letter is an anonymous letter, a vile attempt to injure Sir Percival Glyde in my sister's estimation. It has so agitated and alarmed her that I have had the greatest possible difficulty in composing her spirit sufficiently to allow me to leave her room and come here. I know this is a family matter which I ought not to consult you, and in which you can feel no concern or interest. I beg your pardon, Miss Halcombe. I feel the strongest possible concern and interest in anything that affects Miss Fairley's happiness or yours. I'm glad to hear you say so. You're the only person in the house or out of it who can advise me. Mr. Fairley, in his state of health, and with his horror of difficulties and mysteries of all kinds, is not to be thought of. The clergyman is a good, weak man, who knows nothing out of the routine of his duties, and our neighbours are just the sort of comfortable, jog-trot acquaintances whom one cannot disturb in times of trouble and danger. What I want to know is this: ought I at once to take such steps as I can to discover the writer of the letter, or ought I to wait and apply to Mr. Fairley's legal adviser to-morrow? It is a question, perhaps a very important one, of gaining or losing a day. Tell me what you think, Mr. Hartright. If necessity had not already obliged me to take you into my confidence under very delicate circumstances, even my helpless situation would perhaps be no excuse for me. But as things are, I surely cannot be wrong, after all that has passed between us, in forgetting that you are a friend of only 3 months' standing. She gave me the letter. It began abruptly, without any preliminary form of address, as follows:
Do you believe in dreams? I hope for your own sake that you do. See what Scripture says about dreams and their fulfillment. Genesis chapter 40 verse 8, chapter 41 verse 25, Daniel chapter 4 verse 18 to 25, and take the warning I send you before it is too late. Last night I dreamt about you, Miss Fairley. I dreamt that I was standing inside the communion rails of a church, I on one side of the altar table, and the clergyman with his surplice and his prayer book on the other. After a time there walked towards us, down the aisle of the church, a man and a woman coming to be married. You were the woman. You looked so pretty and innocent in your beautiful white silk dress and your long white lace veil that my heart felt for you, and the tears came into my eyes. They were tears of pity, young lady, that heaven blesses, and instead of falling from my eyes like the everyday tears that we all of us shed, they turned into 2 rays of light which slanted nearer and nearer to the man standing at the altar with you, till they touched his breast. The 2 rays sprang ill arches like 2 rainbows between me and him. I looked along them, and I saw down into his inmost heart. The outside of the man you were marrying was fair enough to see. He was neither tall nor short. He was a little below the average size. A light, active, high-spirited man, about 45 years old to look at. He had a pale face and was bald over the forehead, but had dark hair on the rest of his head. His beard was shaven on his chin, but was let to grow of a fine, rich brown on his cheeks and his upper lip. His eyes were brown too, and very bright. His nose straight and handsome, and delicate enough to have done for a woman's. His hands the same. He was troubled from time to time with a dry hacking cough, and when he put up his white right hand to his mouth, he showed the red scar of an old wound across the back of it. Have I dreamt of the right man? You know best, Miss Fairley, and you can say if I was deceived or not. Read next what I saw beneath the outside. I entreat you, read and profit. I looked along the 2 rays of light, and I saw down into his inmost heart. It was black as night, and on it were written, in the red flaming letters which are the handwriting of the fallen angel, without pity and without remorse, he has strewn with misery the paths of others, and he will live to strew with misery the path of this woman by his side. I read that, and then the rays of light shifted and pointed over his shoulder, and there, behind him, stood a fiend laughing. And the rays of light shifted once more and pointed over your shoulder, and there, behind you, stood an angel weeping. And the rays of light shifted for the third time and pointed straight between you and that man. They widened and widened, thrusting you both asunder, one from the other. And the clergyman looked for the marriage service in vain. It was gone out of the book, and he shut up the leaves and put it from him in despair. And I woke with my eyes full of tears and my heart beating, for I believe in dreams. Believe too, Miss Fairley, I beg of you, for your own sake, believe as I do. Joseph and Daniel and others in Scripture believed in dreams. Inquire into the past life of that man with a scar on his hand, before you say the words that make you his miserable wife. I don't give you this warning on my account, but on yours. I have an interest in your well-being that will live as long as I draw breath. Your mother's daughter has a tender place in my heart, for your mother was my first, my best, my only friend.
There the extraordinary letter ended, without signature of any sort. The handwriting afforded no prospect of a clue. It was traced on ruled lines in the cramped conventional copy-book character technically termed small hand. It was feeble and faint, and defaced by blots, but had otherwise nothing to distinguish it. "That is not an illiterate letter," said Miss Halcombe, "and at the same time it is surely too incoherent to be the letter of an educated person in the highest ranks of life. The reference to the bridal dress and veil, and other little expressions, seem to point to it as the production of some woman. What do you think, Mr. Hartright?" "I think so too. It seems to me to be not only the letter of a woman, but of a woman whose mind must be—" "Deranged," suggested Miss Halcombe. "It struck me in that light too." I did not answer. While I was speaking, my eyes rested on the last sentence of the letter. "Your mother's daughter has a tender place in my heart, for your mother was my first, my best, my only friend." Those words, and the doubt which had just escaped me as to the sanity of the writer of the letter, acting together on my mind, suggested an idea which I was literally afraid to express openly, or even to encourage secretly. I began to doubt whether my own faculties were not in danger of losing their balance. It seemed almost like a monomania to be tracing back everything strange that happened, everything unexpected that was said, always to the same hidden source and the same sinister influence. I resolved this time, in defence of my own courage and my own sense, to come to no decision that plain fact did not warrant, and to turn my back resolutely on everything that tempted me in the shape of surmise. "If we have any chance of tracing the person who has written this," I said, returning the letter to Miss Halcombe, "there can be no harm in seizing our opportunity the moment it offers. I think we ought to speak to the gardener again about the elderly woman who gave him the letter, and then to continue our inquiries in the village. But first let me ask a question. You mentioned just now the alternative of consulting Mr. Fairley's legal adviser to-morrow. Is there no possibility of communicating with him earlier? Why not to-day?" "I can only explain," replied Miss Halcombe, "by entering into certain particulars connected with my sister's marriage engagement, which I did not think it necessary or desirable to mention to you this morning. One of Sir Percival Glyde's objects in coming here on Monday is to fix the period of his marriage, which has hitherto been left quite unsettled. He is anxious that the event should take place before the end of the year." "Does Miss Fairley know of that wish?" I asked eagerly. "She has no suspicion of it. After what has happened, I shall not take the responsibility upon myself of enlightening her. Sir Percival has only mentioned his views to Mr. Fairley, who has told me himself that he is ready and anxious, as Laura's guardian, to forward them. He's written to London to the family solicitor, Mr. Gilmore. Mr. Gilmore happens to be away in Glasgow on business, and he's replied by proposing to stop at Limmeridge House on his way back to town. He will be arriving to-morrow, and will stay with us a few days, so as to allow Sir Percival time to plead his own cause. If he succeeds, Mr. Gilmore will then return to London, taking with him his instructions for my sister's marriage settlement. You understand now, Mr. Hartright, why I speak of waiting to take legal advice until tomorrow. Mr. Gilmore is the old and tried friend of 2 generations of Fairleys, and we can trust him as we could trust no one else. The marriage settlement. The mere hearing of those 2 words stung me with a jealous despair that was poison to my higher and better instincts. I began to think, it's hard to confess this, but I must suppress nothing from beginning to end of the terrible story that I now stand committed to reveal. I began to think, with a hateful eagerness of hope, of the vague charges against Sir Percival Glyde which the anonymous letter contained. What if those wild accusations rested on a foundation of truth? What if their truth could be proved before the fatal words of consent were spoken and the marriage settlement was drawn? I've tried to think since that the feeling which then animated me began and ended in pure devotion to Miss Fairley's interests, but I have never succeeded in deceiving myself into believing it, and I must not now attempt to deceive others. The feeling began and ended in reckless, vindictive, hopeless hatred of the man who was to marry her. If we're to find out anything, I said, speaking under the new influence which was now directing me, we had better not let another minute slip by us unemployed. I can only suggest once more the propriety of questioning the gardener a second time, and of inquiring in the village immediately afterwards. I think I may be able to help you in both cases, said Miss Halcombe, rising. Let's go, Mr. Hartright, at once, and do the best we can together. I had the door in my hand to open it for her, but I stopped on a sudden to ask an important question before we set forth. One of the paragraphs in the anonymous letter, I said, contains some sentences of minute personal description. Sir Percival Glyde's name is not mentioned, I know, but does that description at all resemble him? Accurately, even stating his age to be 45. 45, and she was not yet 21. Men of his age married wives of her age every day, and experience had shown those marriages to be often the happiest ones. I knew that, and yet even the mention of his age, when I contrasted it with hers, added to my blind hatred and distrust of him. Accurately, Miss Holcombe continued, even to the scar on his right hand, which is the scar of a wound that he received years since when he was travelling in Italy. There can be no doubt that every peculiarity of his personal appearance is thoroughly well known to the writer of the letter. Even a cough that he is troubled with is mentioned, if I remember right. Yes, and mentioned correctly. He treats it lightly himself, though it sometimes makes his friends anxious about him. I suppose no whispers have ever been heard against his character. Mr. Hartright, I hope you are not unjust enough to let that infamous letter influence you. I felt the blood rush to my cheeks, for I knew it had influenced me. I hope not, I answered confusedly. Perhaps I had no right to ask the question. I'm not sorry you asked it, she said, for it enables me to do justice to Sir Percival's reputation. Not a whisper, Mr. Hartright, has ever reached me or my family against him. He has fought successfully 2 contested elections, and has come out of the ordeal unscathed. A man who can do that in England is a man whose character is established. I opened the door for her in silence and followed her out. She had not convinced me. If the recording angel had come down from heaven to confirm her, and had opened his book to my mortal eyes, the recording angel would not have convinced me. We found the gardener at work as usual. No amount of questioning could extract a single answer of any importance from the lad's impenetrable stupidity. The woman who had given him the letter was an elderly woman. She had not spoken a word to him, and she had gone away towards the south in a great hurry. That was all the gardener could tell us. The village lay southward of the house. So to the village we went next. 12. Our inquiries at Limmeridge were patiently pursued in all directions, and among all sorts and conditions of people, but nothing came of them. 3 of the villagers did certainly assure us that they had seen the woman, but as they were quite unable to describe her, and quite incapable of agreeing about the exact direction in which she was proceeding when they last saw her, these three bright exceptions to the general rule of total ignorance afforded no more real assistance to us than the mass of their unhelpful and unobservant neighbours. The course of our useless investigations brought us in time to the end of the village at which the schools established by Miss Fairley were situated. As we passed the side of the building appropriated to the use of the boys, I suggested the propriety of making a last inquiry of the schoolmaster, whom we might presume to be, in virtue of his office, the most intelligent man in the place. "I'm afraid the schoolmaster must have been occupied with his scholars," said Miss Halcombe, "just at the time when the woman passed through the village and returned again. However, we can but try." We entered the playground enclosure and walked by the schoolroom window to get round to the door, which was situated at the back of the building. I stopped for a moment at the window and looked in. The schoolmaster was sitting at his high desk with his back to me, apparently haranguing the pupils, who were all gathered together in front of him with one exception. The one exception was a sturdy, white-haired boy standing apart from all the rest on a stool in the corner, a forlorn little Crusoe, isolated in his own desert island of solitary penal disgrace. The door, when we got round to it, was ajar, and the schoolmaster's voice reached us plainly as we both stopped for a minute under the porch. "Now, boys," said the voice, "remind what I tell you. If I hear another word spoken about ghosts in this school, it will be the worse for all of you. There are no such things as ghosts, and therefore any boy who believes in ghosts believes in what can't possibly be, and a boy who belongs to Limmeridge School and believes in what can't possibly be sets up his back against reason and discipline, and must be punished accordingly. You all see Jacob Postlethwaite standing up on the stool there in disgrace. He has been punished, not because he said he saw a ghost last night, but because he is too impudent and too obstinate to listen to reason, and because he persists in saying he saw the ghost after I have told him that no such thing can possibly be. If nothing else will do, I mean to cane the ghost out of Jacob Postlethwaite, and if the thing spreads among any of the rest of you, I mean to go a step further and cane the ghost out of the whole school." "We seem to have chosen an awkward moment for our visit," said Miss Halcombe, pushing open the door at the end of the schoolmaster's address and leading the way in. Our appearance produced a strong sensation among the boys. They appeared to think that we had arrived for the express purpose of seeing Jacob Postlethwaite caned. "Go home, all of you, to dinner," said the schoolmaster, "except Jacob. Jacob must stop where he is, and the ghost may bring him his dinner if the ghost pleases." Jacob's fortitude deserted him at the double disappearance of his schoolfellows and his prospect of dinner. He took his hands out of his pockets, looked hard at his knuckles, raised them with great deliberation to his eyes, and when they got there, ground them round and round slowly, accompanying the action by short spasms of sniffing, which followed each other at regular intervals, the nasal minute guns of juvenile distress. "We came here to ask you a question, Mr. Dempster," said Miss Halcombe, addressing the schoolmaster, "and we little expected to find you occupied in exorcising a ghost. What does it all mean? What has really happened?" "That wicked boy has been frightening the whole school, Miss Halcombe, by declaring that he saw a ghost yesterday evening," answered the master, "and he still persists in his absurd story, in spite of all that I can say to him." "Most extraordinary," said Miss Halcombe. "I should not have thought it possible that any of the boys had imagination enough to see a ghost. This is a new accession indeed to the hard labor of forming the youthful mind at Limmeridge, and I heartily wish you well through it, Mr. Dempster. In the meantime, let me explain why you see me here, and what it is I want." She then put the same question to the schoolmaster which we had already asked of almost everyone else in the village. It was met with the same discouraging answer. Mr. Dempster had not set eyes on the stranger of whom we were in search. "We may as well return to the house, Mr. Hartwright," said Miss Halcombe. "The information we want is evidently not to be found." She had bowed to Mr. Dempster and was about to leave the schoolroom when the forlorn position of Jacob Postlethwaite, piteously sniffing on the stool of penitence, attracted her attention as she passed him, and made her stop good-humoredly to speak a word to the little prisoner before she opened the door. "You foolish boy," she said. "Why don't you beg Mr. Dempster's pardon and hold your tongue about the ghost?" "Eh, but I saw t' ghaist," persisted Jacob Postlethwaite, with a stare of terror and a burst of tears. "Stuff and nonsense! You saw nothing of the kind. Ghost, indeed! What ghost?" "I beg your pardon, Miss Halcombe," interposed the schoolmaster a little uneasily, "but I think you'd better not question the boy. The obstinate folly of his story is beyond all belief, and you might lead him into ignorantly—" "Ignorantly what?" inquired Miss Halcombe, somewhat sharply. "Ignorantly shocking your feelings," said Mr. Dempster, looking very much discomposed. "Upon my word, Mr. Dempster, you pay my feelings a great compliment in thinking them weak enough to be shocked by such an urchin as that." She turned with an air of satirical defiance to little Jacob, and began to question him directly. "Come," she said, "I mean to know all about this, you naughty boy. When did you see the ghost?" "Yestereen at the gloaming," replied Jacob. "Oh, you saw it yesterday evening in the twilight. And what was it like?" "All in white, as a ghaist should be," answered the ghost seer, with a confidence beyond his years. "And where was it?" "Away yonder in the kirkyard, where a ghaist ought to be." "As a ghaist ought to be. Where a ghaist ought to be. Why, you little fool, you talk as if manners and customs of ghosts had been familiar to you from your infancy. Have you got your story at your fingers' ends, at any rate? I suppose I shall hear next that you can actually tell me whose ghost it was." "Eh, but I just can," replied Jacob, nodding his head with an air of gloomy triumph. Mr. Dempster had already tried several times to speak while Miss Halcombe was examining his pupil, and now he interposed resolutely enough to make himself heard. "Excuse me, Miss Halcombe," he said, "if I may venture to say that you are only encouraging the boy by asking him these questions." "I will merely ask one more, Mr. Dempster, and then I shall be quite satisfied. Well," she continued, turning to the boy, "and whose ghost was it?" "T' ghaist of Mistress Fairlie," answered Jacob in a whisper. The effect which this extraordinary reply produced on Miss Halcombe fully justified the anxiety which the schoolmaster had shown to prevent her from hearing it. Her face crimsoned with indignation. She turned upon little Jacob with an angry suddenness which terrified him into a fresh burst of tears, opened her lips to speak to him, then controlled herself, and addressed the master instead of the boy. "It is useless," she said, "to hold such a child as that responsible for what he says. I have little doubt that the idea has been put into his head by others. If there are people in this village, Mr. Dempster, who have forgotten the respect and gratitude due from every soul in it to my mother's memory, I will find them out, and if I have any influence with Mr. Fairlie, they shall suffer for it." "I hope, indeed, I'm sure, Miss Halcombe, that you're mistaken," said the schoolmaster. "The matter begins and ends with the boy's own perversity and folly. He saw, or thought he saw, a woman in white yesterday evening as he was passing the churchyard, and the figure, real or fancied, was standing by the marble cross, which he and everyone else in Limmeridge knows to be the monument over Mrs. Fairlie's grave. These two circumstances are surely sufficient to have suggested to the boy himself the answer which has so naturally shocked you." Although Miss Halcombe did not seem to be convinced, she evidently felt that the schoolmaster's statement of the case was too sensible to be openly combated. She merely replied by thanking him for his attention, and by promising to see him again when her doubts were satisfied. This said, she bowed and led the way out of the schoolroom. Throughout the whole of this strange scene I had stood apart, listening attentively and drawing my own conclusions. As soon as we were alone again, Miss Halcombe asked me if I had formed any opinion on what I had heard. "A very strong opinion," I answered. "The boy's story, as I believe, has foundation in fact. I confess I'm anxious to see the monument over Mrs. Fairlie's grave, and to examine the ground around it." "You shall see the grave." She paused after making that reply, and reflected a little as we walked on. "What has happened in the schoolroom," she resumed, "has so completely distracted my attention from the subject of the letter that I feel a little bewildered when I try to return to it. Must we give up all idea of making any further inquiries, and wait to place the whole thing in Mr. Gilmore's hands to-morrow?" "By no means, Miss Halcombe. What has happened in the schoolroom encourages me to persevere in the investigation." "Why does it encourage you?" because it strengthens a suspicion I felt when you gave me the letter to read." "I suppose you had your reasons, Mr. Hartwright, for concealing that suspicion from me until this moment?" "I was afraid to encourage it in myself. I thought it was utterly preposterous. I distrusted it as the result of some perversity in my own imagination. But I can do so no longer. Not only the boy's own answers to your questions, but even a chance expression that dropped from the schoolmaster's lips in explaining his story, have forced the idea back into my mind. Events may yet prove that idea to be an illusion, Miss Halcombe, but the belief is strong in me at this moment that the fancied ghost in the churchyard and the writer of the anonymous letter are one and the same person." She stopped, turned pale, and looked me eagerly in the face. "What person?" "The schoolmaster unconsciously told you. When he spoke of the figure that the boy saw in the churchyard, he called it a woman in white." "Not Anne Catherick?" "Yes, Anne Catherick." She put her hand through my arm and leaned on it heavily. "I don't know why," she said in low tones, "but there is something in this suspicion of yours that seems to startle and unnerve me. I feel—" She stopped and tried to laugh it off. "Mr. Hartwright," she went on, "I will show you the grave, and then go back at once to the house. I'd better not leave Laura too long alone. I'd better go back and sit with her." We were close to the churchyard when she spoke. The church, a dreary building of grey stone, was situated in a little valley, so as to be sheltered from the bleak winds blowing over the moorland all around it. The burial ground advanced from the side of the church a little way up the slope of the hill, and was surrounded by a rough, low stone wall, and was bare and open to the sky, except at one extremity, where a brook trickled down the stony hillside, and a clump of dwarf trees threw their narrow shadows over the short, meagre grass. Just beyond the brook and the trees, and not far from one of the 3 stone stiles which afforded entrance at various points to the churchyard, rose the white marble cross that distinguished Mrs. Fairley's grave from the humbler monuments scattered about it. "I need go no further with you," said Miss Halcombe, pointing to the grave. "You will let me know if you find anything to confirm the idea you've just mentioned to me. Let us meet again at the house." She left me. I descended at once to the churchyard and crossed the stile which led directly to Mrs. Fairley's grave. The grass about it was too short and the ground too hard to show any marks of footsteps. Disappointed thus far, I next looked attentively at the cross, and at the square block of marble below it on which the inscription was cut. The natural whiteness of the cross was a little clouded here and there by weather stains, and rather more than half of the square block beneath it, on the side which bore the inscription, was in the same condition. The other half, however, attracted my attention at once by its singular freedom from stain or impurity of any kind. I looked closer, and saw that it had been cleaned, recently cleaned, in a downward direction from top to bottom. The boundary line between the part that had been cleaned and the part that had not was traceable wherever the inscription left a blank space of marble, sharply traceable, as a line that had been produced by artificial means. Who had begun the cleansing of the marble, and who had left it unfinished? I looked about me, wondering how the question was to be solved. No sign of a habitation could be discerned from the point at which I was standing. The burial ground was left in the lonely possession of the dead. I returned to the church and walked round it till I came to the back of the building, then crossed the boundary wall beyond by another of the stone stiles, and found myself at the head of a path leading down to a deserted stone quarry. Against one side of the quarry a little 2-room cottage was built, and just outside the door an old woman was engaged in washing. I walked up to her and entered into conversation about the church and burial ground. She was ready enough to talk, and almost the first words she said informed me that her husband fulfilled the 2 offices of clerk and sexton. I said a few words next in praise of Mrs. Fairley's monument. The old woman shook her head, and told me I had not seen it at its best. It was her husband's business to look after it, but he had been so ailing and weak for months and months past that he had hardly been able to crawl into church on Sundays to do his duty, and the monument had been neglected in consequence. He was getting a little better now, and in a week or 10 days' time he hoped to be strong enough to set to work and clean it. This information, extracted from a long, rambling answer in the broadest Cumberland accent, told me all that I most wanted to know. I gave the poor woman a trifle and returned at once to Limmeridge House. The partial cleaning of the monument had evidently been accomplished by a strange hand. Connecting what I had discovered thus far with what I had suspected after hearing the story of the ghost seen at twilight, I wanted nothing more to confirm my resolution to watch Mrs. Fairlie's grave in secret that evening, returning to it at sunset, and waiting within sight of it till night fell. The work of cleansing the monument had been left unfinished, and the person by whom it had been begun might return to complete it. On getting back to the house, I informed Miss Halcombe of what I intended to do. She looked surprised and uneasy while I was explaining my purpose, but she made no positive objection to the execution of it. She only said, "I hope it may end well." Just as she was leaving me again, I stopped her to inquire as calmly as I could after Miss Fairlie's health. She was in better spirits, and Miss Halcombe hoped that she might be induced to take a little walking exercise while the afternoon sun lasted. I returned to my own room to resume setting the drawings in order. It was necessary to do this, and doubly necessary to keep my mind employed on anything that would help to distract my attention from myself and from the hopeless future that lay before me. From time to time I paused in my work to look out of the window and watch the sky as the sun sank nearer and nearer to the horizon. On one of those occasions I saw a figure on the broad gravel walk under my window. It was Miss Fairlie. I had not seen her since the morning, and I had hardly spoken to her then. Another day at Limmeridge was all that remained to me, and after that day my eyes might never look upon her again. This thought was enough to hold me at the window. I had sufficient consideration for her to arrange the blind so that she might not see me if she looked up, but I had no strength to resist the temptation of letting my eyes at least follow her as far as they could on her walk. She was dressed in a brown cloak, with a plain black silk gown under it. On her head was the same simple straw hat which she had worn on the morning we first met. A veil was attached to it now, which hid her face from me. By her side trotted a little Italian greyhound, the pet companion of all her walks, smartly dressed in a scarlet cloth wrapper, to keep the sharp air from his delicate skin. She did not seem to notice the dog. She walked straight forward, with her head drooping a little, and her arms folded in her cloak. The dead leaves which had swirled in the wind before me, when I had heard of her marriage engagement in the morning, whirled in the wind before her, and rose and fell, and scattered themselves at her feet as she walked on in the pale waning sunlight. The dog shivered and trembled, and pressed against her dress impatiently for notice and encouragement, but she never heeded him. She walked on, further and further away from me, with the dead leaves whirling about her on the path, walked on, till my aching eyes could see her no more, and I was left alone again with my heavy heart. In another hour's time I had done my work, and the sunset was at hand. I got my hat and coat in the hall, and slipped out of the house without meeting anyone. The clouds were wild in the western heaven, and the wind blew chill from the sea. Far as the shore was, the sound of the surf swept over the intervening moorland, and beat drearily in my ears when I entered the churchyard. Not a living creature was in sight. The place looked lonelier than ever as I chose my position, and waited and watched, with my eyes on the white cross that rose over Mrs. Fairlie's grave.
End of Track 4.